you. Good morning, everyone. What are we going to talk about today? The state of the industry. And I think we all have seen what's happening. It's an era of convergence. We're looking at a couple of different names for what we probably believe is the same thing: personalized medicine, precision medicine, companion diagnostics, combination products. It's a challenging era, but it also is very rewarding with a lot of value creation when you combine traditional biopharmaceuticals with cutting edge drug delivery models or cutting edge device or diagnostic information. So I'd like to welcome my panel and have each of them introduce themselves. And we'll start with Andrew.
Good morning. Thanks, Vicki. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Andy Fish. I currently am the executive director of AdvaMed DX, or AdvaMed Diagnostics. AdvaMed DX is the diagnostics division of AdvaMed, which is the leading medtech trade association representing global medtech industry manufacturers worldwide. While we're headquartered here in the U.S., we do have a significant global footprint as well. And I'm pleased to be here and talk about all the things that we're doing relevant in this area.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Daly. I'm actually the Uber driver that drove Andy from the airport. They needed a fill-in. I'm the president and CEO of Cohera medical device company, started in Pittsburgh, and just recently, within the last month, we just relocated to Raleigh, North Carolina. We have a series of unique internal strong adhesives and sealants, and I'm excited to be here this morning and looking forward to some good interaction.
Good morning. My name is Bill Murray. I'm the president and CEO of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. We're a public-private partnership. We focus on trying to accelerate new technology access to patients through the application of science and engineering. We partner with industry, nonprofits, and government to do that, and specifically for devices, CDRH. In addition, as it relates to this conference, I'm on the board of one of the presenting companies this afternoon, Sonics Health.
Thank you. So I have a few questions. We're going to ask the panelists to give us their thoughts, and then we'd also welcome the audience participation and questions. So we're going to save some time at the end for your pressing questions, and I encourage you to ask the panelists some interesting questions because it's a great panel, and we're very lucky to have them here today. So my first question, I'm going to start with Andy. Can you define precision medicine, personalized medicine for us? The words are thrown around a lot together, and I sometimes feel that we use them interchangeably, and maybe they are, or maybe they shouldn't be.
Yeah, I think it's more that we use a lot of terms interchangeably, and they all kind of fit within a broad umbrella. So the term personalized medicine has been generally the term used to describe this convergence of technologies and therapies, and basically things that are designed to mitigate and treat disease that are tailored to the individual characteristics of the patient. That's really the heart of it. And there's been a little bit of a shift that you might have noticed from the term personalized medicine to the term precision medicine, and that's a reaction to the fact that I think a lot of folks in the medical field over time are saying, we've always practiced personalized medicine. We're always treating the person in front of us, the patient, as a person. And so some have pushed for the term precision medicine. And you might have noticed the Obama administration, when it announced its precision medicine initiative, it was the precision medicine initiative, and I think that's the term that's probably going to really kind of take hold going forward. So in its most narrow form, it often used as a phrase meaning genetic information about an individual that allows us to tailor treatment, in particular, to the underlying pathways of disease that are driven by an individual's personal genetic characteristics. So not to go on and on about it, but for example, this is particularly true in the oncology field where there's been a tremendous amount of research and development. So where we used to treat lung cancer, now we more and more treat an individual's lung cancer. And your lung cancer may actually be different than someone else's lung cancer depending on what the underlying drivers are in that cancer. We now know that cancer is more than 100 different diseases with different genetic pathways and sort of pathologies underlying them. So I now have the ability through various diagnostics to determine what the individual diagnostic or cellular sort of pathology is going on in your cancer, and increasingly we can deliver treatments to treat that. I would say, however, more broadly that it's not just about all the things that come out of molecular diagnostics and molecular medicine, but really increasingly the ability to tailor a variety of things to an individual's characteristics. So for example, if you look at a company that is designing a knee implant for an individual by doing a scan of their current knee and joint and then shaping that knee implant specifically for that person's knee, I think it's fairly say that falls under the rubric of precision medicine. So it's really, in some ways, a very broad term.
Bill, how about you?
Well, Andy did a nice job of providing, I think, an overview perspective of this. I'll take a little different track here for a minute. I think the other part of this relates to personalized or precision medicine is the actual patient side of that equation, and the fact that a lot of the technologies now are empowering patients to be more informed and more involved in the decision process and expecting more tailored or precision or personalized care. And we're seeing that in the informed patients. We did a recent research report we published on patient-centered benefit-risk outcomes and how to essentially factors to consider when designing clinical trials. So FDA and reimbursers are interested in understanding in a more scientific way how to incorporate the patient's voice and their choices and benefit risk into the therapeutic decision process. And so I think that's the other aspect when you look at the total continuum of personalized medicine is the patient side and how their expectations are changing in terms of their involvement in decisions in their care.
All right, thank you. Patrick, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and turn it to you. I think you have a very innovative technology. We've been following your pathway and your success for a couple of years now. And I think when we look at the era we're moving into of convergence of technology and patient preference and physician input, why don't you tell us a little bit about what your products do and how you see it moving forward?
Sure, that's a good question. So just a little bit about, I think I'll talk about our first technology. That's the most relevant one now relating to FDA and everything that's gone on. We have a product that is an internal adhesive. So imagine having Gorilla Glue for inside the body. You can glue planes of tissue together. You can use it for a whole host of things. Our first indication here in the U.S. is for abdominoplasty. Excuse me. So a patient does not need to have drains. And I think I put that out there because I think one of the things that we forget in medicine oftentimes is we're very advanced in a lot of areas, but we tend to gloss over things that we've just accepted for 70, 80, 90 years. If you think about the advent of drains, it goes back to Egyptian times when they used cotton wicks for people that had infections. And if you think about a drain today, if you took a drain, a post-surgical drain, and you went to the FDA today and said, I want to get this approved by the FDA, I'd almost be willing to bet that there's no way you're going to get it approved because the outcomes are really barbaric. You know, you're asking a patient to have 3 post-surgical drains after a mastectomy, an abdominoplasty, a decubitus flap, and you're asking them to keep it in for, doctors say, 1 or 2 days. It's in for sometimes 7 to 10 to 2 weeks, 7 to 10 days to 2 weeks. So very uncomfortable. And here's the part that's amazing is then the drains, you take them out, you're in it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And by the way, you know, up to 20% of the patients still have to have aspirations. So I bring all that up because I think in this room are the new technologies. I'd ask you, in our relationship with FDA, you know, we've, you know, pushed back on them on a lot of things. Build a relationship with FDA because in this room, as I get older, I want the cures and the great technologies you have. I think oftentimes companies run really fast, do a great job, and they don't plan ahead for what you have to do, whether it's personalized medicine, whether it's, you know, changing what you're doing with FDA to get it to the point where it's acceptable data, and we run full force into a wall, and then we say, well, FDA screwed us up. They're not there to mess you up. Is if you plan a little bit ahead, you can be successful with them.
Okay, so if we look at convergence, and that's what we're talking about, new technology, innovation, that's going to keep us all healthier, longer, living longer, requiring more medical care. We're talking about crossing sectors. We're talking about biopharmaceutical. We're talking about traditional medtech. We're talking about technology, connected health. So obviously, as the technology we're all developing is changing, the industry itself is changing, and the regulators and the support of this industry needs to change. And I think all of us up here have seen some evidence of that in very different ways. So I'd like to go down the panel and have Andy talk about AdvaMed and what AdvaMed's doing, what AdvaMed's seen. Patrick has had some very interesting and positive relationship development with the FDA, or as we like to say, the new FDA or the newer FDA. And then Bill with MDIC and the public-private forum has really made some great initiatives in bringing us all to the table and having us all speak with the same voice. So we'll start with Andy and just go down the panel.
Sure, great. So I'll make some broader comments, and then I think we'll continue to get into some, more specifics. So just as a general matter, AdvaMed's role, and if you're not familiar with us, is that, among other things, we work very closely with FDA on all matters of regulatory policy. So every time FDA is putting out a draft guidance or a draft regulation, we're developing comments, and we do that by soliciting input, engaging directly with all of our member companies, so that when we engage with FDA, we're reflecting the experience that all of our member companies have had with FDA, or what they're anticipating having to go through with FDA as they bring new products to market. And so on the combination products area, we're deeply engaged with FDA, as we are in all areas. And for example, there's a draft guidance out on good manufacturing practices for combination products, and we're working on that and so forth. And I guess what I would say, broadly in the area of combination products is that it's been a bit of a challenge for FDA in terms of internal coordination, and that's the way they handle these issues now. Is they kind of determine, whether, first of all, whether a product's a combination product, right? So just to be a little bit pedantic just for a moment, statute defines drug and it defines device, but it doesn't define combination product. And interestingly, actually, devices are in fact drugs because they fall within the broader definition of a drug. But then basically, if the device is defined as an instrument or an apparatus that doesn't have a chemical mode of action and isn't metabolized. And so basically, FDA looks at a product and makes a determination whether it's classified as a drug or a medical device. But if it has characteristics of both, then of course it's a combination product. And then FDA has to coordinate with internally between, 2 or potentially more centers to figure out how it's going to go through those approvals. And that puts a lot of pressure on the developer of the product, because you've got to satisfy 2 now different kind of regulatory, paradigms within FDA at the same time. It has big implications pre-market and post-market and so forth. So the ongoing challenge for FDA is to figure out how to do this efficiently, how to think about the implications of combination products and whether new issues arise because these products are in combination. They've certainly made significant progress in certain areas because they're familiar. We've trod the ground, if you will. Drug-eluting stents, for example, are a good and obvious example of a combination product. Companion diagnostics are thought generally of as a combination product, even though they are not literally 2 things in one product. A diagnostic that is necessary for the safe and effective use of a therapeutic is generally considered a combination product with that drug. And they're typically approved concurrently, sometimes even simultaneously. And their labeling indicates that they are to be used together. So FDA has experience in bringing certain kinds of combination products through the regulatory process. But as Vicki was alluding to, there's tremendous convergence happening, and I think we see in the coming decade that will be significantly expanding FDA's challenges in terms of figuring out how to wrestle with new technologies. I mean, if we look ahead to things like maybe an insulin pump that's not just delivering insulin at the direction of the user or a sort of a pre-programmed state, but it's actually diagnosing levels of glucose in the blood on a continuous basis and and injecting insulin accordingly. Now you've got a diagnostic and a drug and a device all working together. And there's a myriad of examples that we can all think of. And if you generally think of all the things that are going on with wearable sensors and so forth, I think you can even just we can just sort of sit here and spin out scenarios of things that even if they seem a little fantastical today are probably not actually that far away. So I'll just stop there because I think we can get into some more details. But the bottom line is that we still have a lot of challenges ahead of us. It's a major focus for FDA. And legislation was actually introduced in the Senate this past summer whose intent is to streamline and make more efficient the combination product review process at FDA.
Okay, I'm gonna. Andy is way smarter than me. I'm gonna dumb it down. I'm a lunch pail guy running a small company. I'm gonna give 2 shameless plugs. If you are not a member of MDIC or AdvaMed or one of our trade associations, I would highly recommend that you do so. I resisted for a long time, and about 3 years into my company, gentleman I went to school with said, "Hey, you need to look at AdvaMed." If you look at 85% of the companies there, they're small companies, and so I'm now on the Emerging Growth Council. It's called Excel. I will tell you it is the best money you'll ever spend because you get to rub elbows with all the big company folks. You have really smart folks like Bill and Andy and the folks that are running your group that can give you a lot of information that, I don't know how you guys are, but I'm pretty used to 20-hour days and I don't have 5 consultants. These guys act as consultants for you. So that's shameless plug number 1. Shameless plug number 2, I thought I'd never say this because I am the antithesis of a big government person. I am the opposite, right? I just think government should deliver our mail and, protect our shores kind of guy. But I will tell you, give FDA credit. Dr. Shurin, Dr. Maisel, they really do want to make a change at FDA. And the thing that I'm seeing now that I interact more with them and now that I'm on the board and I see them in Maryland quite a bit, is it's amazing how many companies come to them unprepared. I'm not saying anyone here is doing that, but if you do a little bit of homework with FDA, they truly do want to make a difference. And if you make the effort to do so, and not just when you get like a pre-submission, you get written feedback that you say, the heck with it, push back on them, but push back in a logical, senseful way. They'll work with you. And because I think what they're seeing is, historically, you all know, probably about 6-7 years ago, the FDA ground to almost a halt. And, I did a class 3 PMA. They had gone from 270 days in review up to like 500 days, which is really more than 500 days because if you take the time prior to that. So they see that. They understand that a lot of people are offshoring things, going overseas, moving companies. So, I think it's a great opportunity that if you want to work with FDA, put your best foot forward. So that's the simple company line. I'll turn it over to Bill.
Yeah, just to add to the perspective here, a couple things. First, sometimes it gets a little confusing. AdvaMed's actually a member of MDIC. We complement each other. We're not competitors. We work in the science. We work on more of the engineering. We do not get involved in the policy side. How I got involved with MDIC is an interesting story because I used to run a startup obesity company, and kind of to Patrick's point, and it wasn't a combination product per se, but it was a white space area where there wasn't a clear path forward. And I remember vividly being on a panel with 6 of my peers, all startup companies at Cleveland Clinic, and none of us had defined endpoints for our studies. It was like a field of dreams where if we build it, they will come, and then all of a sudden it's, no endpoints, and we're all burning cash trying to figure out what we're going to do. And so your counsel about engaging early. And so when I actually talked about joining MDIC, I met with Director Shurin, and he was very committed to get us involved early. We need to know what's going on, and if you wait till you get to the front door, we're both going to be surprised. And so he's very much in that camp. I will also add that the nominated commissioner, currently Deputy Commissioner Califf, is also very much supportive of what we're doing, and he is focused and said he wants to focus on combination products. I will tell you he's an evidence-based guy, so you're going to need to have robust evidence for your combination products. But I think in that context, if you come in with a thoughtful approach to how you want to address, analyze, prove your hypothesis around your product, there's people that are really wanting to see those breakthrough new therapies come forward, and they recognize that the system today doesn't really accommodate the combination products, if you will, and then it has to be somewhat tailored or customized at this point in time.
So the world of regulated products is definitely changing. So I'm going to spend 2 minutes giving my point of view here, even though I'm the moderator, but I'm going to have the microphone, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. So I'm going to give additional plugs. I have been a member of AdvaMed since it was not even named AdvaMed, so that dates me, but those of you who can figure it out, that's how old I am. So, and I would say that I encourage small companies, large companies, everyone to join AdvaMed. It is a great source of information. You get incredible access, and you're going to be up to date. MDIC, I'm also very involved in. Absolutely love it. I talk about it all the time. When I give interviews, I even plug it shamelessly because it's the first time in my career, which going back to the old name of AvaMed. You can see how long I've been around. This is the first time I've seen everyone at the table. Everyone's at the table. You don't need name tags. It doesn't matter. The FDA, CMS, payers, large industry, small industry, everyone's at the table and everyone has a common goal. So those of you out there who have these challenging, innovative, great next-gen products, get involved in your industry. You really should, because that way when you show up at the FDA's door, you're going to recognize someone. You're going to have a partner that's going to help you. I'm currently working on about 4 cutting-edge projects. They really are. They're projects that they're kind of where Patrick was years ago. There's something no one's seen before. And the FDA is there with us. They're helping us. They're communicating. It's not that we're not going to have to collect a lot of evidence, because believe me, we are. But we all know that because we want to put safe products out there. So get involved. I know it's hard when you're really busy and you're working 20-hour days, but find a friend and get involved, because it will really serve you well. That's my speech. So now I'm going to ask another really interesting question. We're here today because there's 20 amazing new companies that are going to present, and they're going to show us new technology and new innovation. And I'm pretty sure that they're all looking to create value and to find investment to bring these products to market. So on the panel today, I'd like to ask you, what do you see that really will drive value? What's going to drive value for these companies that we're all going to sit and listen to later? What should they be thinking of and focusing of that we know from working with investors is what the investors want to see?
I'll give just one perspective on it, and it's a broad point, but I think it's really critical, and many people are saying it. So it's not an original thought. And I say that, from the investor standpoint, what the investor, of course, wants ultimately is a return. The best way to find value in the medical system is to make a difference. And I think that, historically, too many companies have not focused like a laser on what is the delta that I'm going to drive in patient care with this technology, whether it's an iteration of a device that's already on the market, either mine or someone else's, or it's innovative kind of new tech. You really have to focus from the very beginning. I would say even as you're just in the very early kind of R&D development stages of thinking, I could bring this thing to market down the road. Should I? One of your very first questions should not be, can I get it through FDA, or can I get it reimbursed? It needs to be an underlying question, which is, what kind of difference is this actually going to make in a doctor's decision making or in a patient's ultimate healthcare status or outcomes? And how can I measure that? And if I can't figure out how to characterize the delta in clinical care that's going to be driven by my product, then you've really got to rethink, what you're doing, and give it some more thought, because that's going to be really critical ultimately, not just to, approval, but ultimately getting reimbursed and getting utilized within a health system or multiple systems. And I think that is a paradigm that companies are increasingly sensitive to, but interestingly, it's not where everyone's head has always been in terms of bringing technology, forward. A lot of times I think some tech has come forward to, grab Bill's term, if we build it, we can sell it. And increasingly, that's not true. Payers are starting to push back a lot more on buying the next thing. And health systems are increasingly driven to have, value-based models where they're making calculations about where to allocate a healthcare dollar that are based on, ultimate clinical utility. So companies really have to, be focused on being able to kind of demonstrate that equation. So it's a broad point, but I really think it's critical. It should frame the way every company, large and small, is thinking about what it brings, to the market next. And if you can do that, then you'll find value in in the system. And to Patrick's point earlier, you really have to ultimately focus on the patient. What's going to make a difference ultimately in the patient's life in some form, whether it's quality of care, whether it's ultimate outcomes. There's always ways to extract costs from the system, right? There's always going to be a device that brings some efficiency into a surgical process, for example, and there's certainly value to be captured there. But I think the ultimate value is going to be captured in driving that delta in ultimate outcomes. And we could talk more about big data and other things like that too, where there's certainly value to be captured. But that's the broad point that I think is important to underscore.
I'll make a couple comments here. We did a survey last year of all of our members, industry members, and the number one issue that came up was reimbursement across the board. It wasn't even close. The regulatory issues had been like 3 or 4 years prior the big hurdle, but reimbursement has come to the top of the list. And a lot of it gets to predictability, if you will. And when I talk behind the scenes with some of the payers, they won't say this out loud, but if you can get them, if you will, off the record, they'll say that a lot of the companies come in and they talk about these huge markets, a massive market that you're going to treat, tens or hundreds of millions of patients in the case of obesity. That scares the payers. And so to Andy's point, I think in terms of commercially getting your product paid for, focus on that group of patients where you're going to get a significant effect size, where you can really make a difference. And so while over the long term you might be able to learn and expand, the insurers have the payers have a natural tendency to just not want to go there if the market's going to quote unquote break the bank. So just be aware of that, and I think about what segment of that population you can treat is going to benefit the most and realize the most significant clinical and economic benefit and value, if you will. The second thing is if you have a product that has some preference-sensitive aspects to it, so i.e. a patient choice in that and a patient voice, that is politically, there is a lot of very active patient groups in chronic diseases now that have become very adept in working the system to get access to technologies for their patients. And so if you happen to have something that you think is really a value-add technology in diabetes or heart failure or some of those areas where there are well-developed, sophisticated patient groups, that engage with those groups as well, because they can be very helpful in facilitating getting your technology adopted and paid for.
All right, so you always have to have someone on the panel that's going to be provocative. So I'm going to be a little provocative here, okay? If you think about where medicine is, and just think 20 years ago, I remember when I started at Johnson & Johnson, I remember the Cordis rep. I hated this guy because the Palmaz Schatz stent came out. Cordis was the only one that had it. And this dude never left his house. I was in Kansas City. He had 3 Watts lines, the old 800 numbers, right? This is before cell phones and just had pagers. And he literally sat at his desk 8 hours a day and just took phone calls. He made about $1 million a year for 2 years until, obviously, competition came in. But you think about how innovative that was. And if you remember, doctors were throwing in 5 stents in, one artery, right? It was the heyday of making money in that stuff. Now think about it. I mean, I was a rep for the famous Michael DeBakey, and he'd walk into the OR and he would do the distal anastomosis, and everyone would be quiet, and he would do it, and he'd have 9 or 10 ORs going at a time, and you can say you had your heart done with Michael DeBakey. We don't even talk about that anymore. Just think about how far we've come in just 20 years. So people out in this audience have something that can be a game changer. I think we're spoiled a little bit when it comes to medicine, and what happens is we want all the latest and greatest, but we're not willing to pay for it. So I agree with everything that was said here. I think from a business perspective, if you believe in your technology and you think it's a game changer, you think it, even if it's just a niche play, have a business plan, execute it fiercely, and people will invest in you, and it will be successful. That's bottom line.
Make one more comment that I think is closely connected here is sort of, especially in the combination product area. You're probably, if you're in this area, we're looking at a convergence type product, you're not the only player, right? You're partnering up with someone else. If you're bringing a product to market that's a device delivering a drug, you very well may be partnering up with a drug manufacturer, for example. Now we have some companies they're doing both under the same roof, but the point here is to be thinking through early on your business model. Are you dependent on getting reimbursed ultimately, or your customers getting reimbursed on your component of that product, and the other developer of the other piece or side of that component of that product is entirely on their own getting reimbursed for that piece of their product? And the point I'm making, and I'll give an illustration basically across diagnostics, for example, as our diagnostic member companies work with pharmaceutical companies, especially in the area of companion diagnostics, where the products are not literally, combined in one physical thing. There's two entirely separate, different reimbursement paradigms, right? But the diagnostic companies feel, and it's true, that they are driving market access for, companion therapeutics. They are. Without those diagnostics, you would not have that marketplace. You would not be able to identify the right patients. You might not even get that drug approved through FDA because you don't have any way without that diagnostics of narrowing your population down to the point where you can show efficacy. So the challenge there for those diagnostic companies is, what market value are they going to get out of this partnership with that therapeutic company? And if the diagnostic company remains stuck in just a diagnostic reimbursement paradigm without any ability to, get some of that therapeutic, the revenue stream on the therapy side, it may not be that compelling a business proposition for them. So our companies, diagnostic companies in general, look at multiple business models, which include partnering up with therapeutic developers, early on in the drug, R&D process, and capturing some revenue there, or figuring out other ways, to share revenue. So it's not just a diagnostics play when you're working with another partner. So it's an obvious point, but I think that's something you have to think through very early on. Is what ultimately is the business model if you're partnering up with some other developer to bring a combination product through. You've got to think early on about whether or not the other player is really in a better financial position, and how are you going to capture a more equitable relationship with that developer.
So that was the question I was going to ask. So no, great. But I want to take a little bit different spin on it and maybe ask if one of you would like to speak on it. We're seeing a lot with sensors, connected health, and it being used to monitor, and then a diagnostic to drive a therapy. So you've got technology, maybe with an app. You've got a diagnostics, which is some sort of sample, and then you've got eventually a therapeutic, which is either a device treatment or some sort of biopharmaceutical or immunotherapy. And when you look at the different players in this, these are players who traditionally have not created a business plan together, have not created value together. If they're small and they're emerging and they have something really new, you're talking about almost three unique different business plans trying to come together. And do you have any advice on how to do that? Because we see a lot of we have an app, we have a diagnostic, we have a device or a biopharmaceutical, and they don't work unless they're connected. They really don't. And there's really not value unless it's all connected. So have you seen any examples of that? And how would you advise companies who really to look for that? Because I think what I'm seeing is that someone may have a diagnostics and they don't realize that someone else has a sensor and app, and someone else, and the therapy is downstream. But they really need to connect it early, in my opinion.
I can give an example. It's not a product yet. It's actually still in the research stage, but it goes along those lines, Vicki, and it's a Parkinson's technology that's being reviewed. So we engaged with the Michael J. Fox Foundation and found out that they had developed an app and they have somewhere around 10,000 Parkinson's patients that have essentially an iPhone app that they strap to their wrist to monitor tremors. And so what they can do then is, on a real-time basis, monitor the efficacy of a drug or a device as it relates to actual tremors. And it's real-time, and you can get thousands of patients in a very cost-effective way without putting a big infrastructure in place. There's a lot of discussion around trying to have post-market understanding of how devices perform. This kind of technology and applying that kind of technology makes it very cost-effective to do something like that. So this is still in the research stage, but we actually found out about the opportunity again by going to the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and they had already developed this infrastructure for their patients because they were so motivated to find ways to show whether or not a therapy was truly working.
Let's talk about outside the United States. So we're all 20 companies more going to talk to us today. Lots of interesting technology. We've seen a lot of routes that have been sort of tried and true over the last few years. We're going to go to Europe. We're going to come to the United States. Then we're going to go somewhere else, maybe Asia. Is that changing? And how should companies really look at their global market and where they should go first? And are there any, do you see different geographies now emerging as maybe a go-to geography? The regulations in Europe are changing. We're all aware of that. The FDA, as we're going to call it today, the new FDA, what else is changing out there, and how do you advise companies when they come to you about looking globally, thinking globally when they plan their business?
If you don't mind, I'm going to jump in on this. So in just the last 7 years, that has completely flipped. So how many folks, just because I want to get participation, it's first thing in the morning, I see people glazing over a little bit. How many people have done a study in Europe or outside the U.S.? How many are doing it in the U.S.? So the remainder haven't done studies yet. So here's just a quick snapshot. If you look at Europe, and I don't mean to offend any European friends here, it's not meant to be specific about a country, but if you look at most of Southern Europe, right, there's issues with reimbursement, with government health care. You know, there's a couple of places now in Europe, Germany, Netherlands, UK, that you can effectively do clinical trials and get good throughput. And even the UK, it takes a long time. There's a lot of lead time. There are countries that are really trying to push. Australia, for example, has an R&D tax credit. If you set up shop there through an entity, you know, they give you back 45 cents on the dollar if you do your clinical trial there. They realize it's a pretty big business. But ultimately, if you're a U.S.-based company and you want the big companies, particularly in medical device, I can't speak for pharma, so you know, bear with me on that. But if you're a medical device, the bellwether now is FDA approval. So it is good to get the CE mark. It's what we did on all of our products. We did the CE mark first. It's really nice to get it because then you can do your clinical trials. Once it's approved, you can continue to expand your clinical base. But at the end of the day, almost every company will look at you and say, I'm going to value you based on whether you're a 510K or a PMA here in the U.S. That was definitively different 8 years ago. So it has changed considerably.
I think this requires having a lot more market intelligence than I can provide, but I'll make a couple broad comments, and certainly I think I generally agree with Patrick's observation. CDRH commissioner, or director Jeff Shuren has been saying recently, sort of citing a study that indicated that while products might have gotten a CE mark significantly earlier than they acquired FDA approval, it was ultimately FDA approval that drove utilization in Europe. And I think it goes to that point that FDA approval, even if you can get on the market elsewhere earlier, is still a sort of a gold standard, a stamp of approval that carries significant weight. But I would also encourage anyone who's looking ex-US to think about not just the pre-market sort of regulatory paradigm of where are you going to get onto the market the easiest, but think about aspects of the healthcare system that you're trying to get into and whether or not you have a chance to make more of an impact in some fashion in another healthcare system. Healthcare systems that are less developed may offer more of an opportunity to bring in a kind of an innovative game changer, especially in this area of convergence. And I think of the sort of general analogy of bringing wireless, cell phones to Africa, right? I mean, cell phones became the dominant, communications technology and almost completely leapfrogged, landlines, because there were no landlines in many places. They just never built that infrastructure. And cell phones offered an opportunity to come in and sort of cope in that system and deliver a huge value. And just a general comment, but I would think about, sort of emerging market healthcare systems and whether or not you've got an opportunity to make that kind of difference and to leapfrog, kind of the absence of some infrastructure that we may have here, and bring something really, of value to those markets.
One of the technologies that is maybe a little bit of a counter to what we talked about here is percutaneous valves, which were approved first in Europe, but also commercially had success in Europe. And it gets again to, if you have a value proposition and a demand, I think in that case, and that was one where they actually were able to generate significant revenue after CE mark, because it was 5 or 6 years before they actually saw approval in the U.S. And the uptick and adoption was pretty significant outside the U.S. But that was the exception as opposed to the rule, I think, in general. So as with everything, it gets down to the specifics.
So I think what I'd like to do is have each of you talk about some challenges you see as we go forward with this the convergence of all our technologies, and also, I guess, some best practices. Just a few each, what you think people really should look at. I mean, I know that everyone here is hearing that we're changing, that the regulations are changing, but I think what we all know is that you need to show the value for your product. You need to say how you're making a difference, but then you have to figure out how to get paid for it also. So keep in mind that reimbursement, wherever you go, no matter how easy the pathway that you choose, you're still going to have to find a way to get paid for your product in order to drive other markets. So I think that's my one that I would say, always remember that reimbursement is a challenge, and you need to really know where you're going for your first market so that you can actually, other than just say we're there, actually start showing adoption and showing that you're being paid and that the value was created for your product.
There was a study, I think it was Tufts, that was published about a year ago, and it was 12 years of data that looked at regulatory approvals over quartiles, so every 3 years, and then reimbursement. And it went from, I think, 1999, don't quote me on that, to 2011 or 12. In the first 3 years, the regulatory and the reimbursement approvals were much more aligned. When you got to the out years, so 2010, 11, and 12, you were 20 times less likely to get a favorable reimbursement approval than you were in the first era. And so, and part of that is because what's happened is the expectations in terms of evidence of value have increased. And so, and what's putting pressure on the device side of this as we start to look at combination products is clinical trial costs and scope and expectations that are much more pharma-like in how they, the costs and expectations. And so I think we're going to have to look at the challenges are going to be what new innovative paradigms can we use to change that so that the economics are achievable, or else there will be a challenge to get some of these new technologies, not necessarily just through FDA, but clearly through the reimbursement side, and that gets to who's going to fund them to start with.
So just on the provocative side again, how many people here would be willing to pay if I'm going to go back to the stent argument, okay? I come up to you and say, okay, you have 2 blockages. You have a choice. I can crack your chest open. You go on a pump. You're in the hospital for 10 days. You go home. You have, your sternum is cut open. It's painful. That's $5,000. But to put in stents is $7,000. I'm curious, how many people, raise your hand, would choose the less costly option? That's the paradigm shift. This is the tectonic fight that is happening now. We want everything really quickly. We want a 70-inch flat screen TV, a car that can park itself, and a perpetual hot cup of coffee, but we're not willing to pay an extra $2,000 for a better outcome. Think about how absurd that is, right? As an industry, I think that's why AvMed, MDIC, all this is really good, because as an industry, we let ourselves get kind of lassoed into a corner that we have to come up with this great technology, spend 20 years developing it. It's better for the patient, better for the hospital, better for everything, and then all of a sudden we have some minion in a corner saying, yeah, but it's $8,000 more expensive up front. And you say, yeah, but for the continuum of that patient, you save $50,000. That's the one piece of advice I would give you is when you're building out your business models and you're thinking about how you're going to launch a product and how you're going to differentiate yourself, don't worry about the upfront costs. I mean, you can't be $1 million versus $1,000 and get the same outcomes. But if you have better outcomes, it's a better product. My personal view, again, back to the provocative piece, is I think our medical culture is going to change. I don't think millennials, I don't think younger people are going to tolerate, or baby boomers for that matter, are going to tolerate inadequate care for a perceived cost difference. So if you could be on that cutting edge, depending on what it is, we've talked about apps, we've talked about accessibility, I think that's going to be a huge change. And if you look at the baby boomers, we're getting hips replaced now, and 2 days later you're walking, and 3 weeks later you're playing tennis. Who would have thought of that 15 years ago? So that was a company that kind of figured it out, the whole industry figured out how to move that forward and get to the consumer.
I want to underscore Patrick's point there because I think that's absolutely critical. It's the first, and we were talking about it a little bit earlier in the panel. I think it's the first thing that you really need to make sure you've got a handle on. Otherwise, you just you don't understand your market well, and you don't know quite where your market will be when you get there. You have got to figure out this really tangled continuum of different stakeholders that are in your value chain, if you will, or your value framework. And you need to understand the payer's perspective and what their interests are and how to sell to a payer. But you need to sell to others who aren't just the ones with the wallet. You have to sell to the utilizers. You have to sell to clinicians. You have to sell to health systems, which may have a different perspective than the clinicians working within the system. And ultimately, if you can, as Patrick stated earlier, you need to sell to patients too. So if you've got the opportunity to build some sort of patient pull through for your product, you really need to focus on that as well. And each of those stakeholders comes at all this from a different perspective. They're going to prioritize kind of different aspects of value, and ultimately, you really need to be able to characterize those different aspects of value and sell to them. The complication that I think you probably all understand is that the entities that pay for technology are not necessarily the entities that realize the corresponding value. So if you look at the continuum of care over either, if it's episodic and it's, X days in a hospital, obviously that's pretty contained. But if you think about ultimate value from the application of technology, it may be lifelong or it may be multiple years. Nobody is realizing the ultimate value of that technology except the patient and society at large. And the patient's not paying, usually, and society at large is not yet paying because we don't have a Medicare system set up to recognize, that long-term value. So you really need to understand the dynamics at play here and figure out how to quantify very specifically your value and figure out who's going to pay for that. And so I think that's, if you take away one thing, honestly, from this conversation, I would say it's that. Figure that out because you have got to be able to sell clinical utility of your product. Just to come back to convergence, since that's really a lot of the focus of this panel, just very quickly. I think we could spend a whole nother hour or more talking about all the ways in which these technologies that we're looking at now could converge, and I think it's it's important if you're in the sensor area, diagnostics, wearables, et cetera, or thinking about digital health. There's a lot to to learn and a lot that's unknown as of yet. So, for example, we can imagine a lab on a chip implanted within your body that's monitoring glucose or looking for circulating tumor cells, for example, sending a signal to your smartphone. I mean, the technology's out there. There's the ability to do this. It's coming. But think about whether or not on your smartphone now there's a software algorithm that needs to sort of process the signals that are coming off that chip and produce an answer. There's a tremendous amount of work going on now at FDA in terms of regulating software and trying to figure out how to regulate these things that are all working together. Somebody's going to make a huge amount of money ultimately here, breaking down old paradigms and bringing diagnostics and information right to the patient, point of patient information and diagnosis, wireless communication back into the health systems, monitoring a post-op patient, monitoring a a cancer patient in remission, maybe in real time to detect cancer at unbelievably early stages of potential recurrence. These are the things that are going to break current paradigms, and they hold tremendous value. But the only way you're going to get there is unraveling some very complicated questions around how do you work, as Vicki said, with a lot of different players, bring these components together, and who exactly is going to pay you, and how are you going to share that revenue with your partners. So this is less a roadmap to these issues than to say you need to be keenly aware of these complexities and continuing in getting as much information as you can about these issues.
We'd like to open it up for questions from the audience, and I'm sure that someone will have an interesting one for the team.
There's one over there.
You two share a mic. That's partial.
While we're waiting for the microphone to get over there, I just want to point out something I just thought of. We're really talking about consumer is a patient, patient is a consumer, and that's really the era we're going in, and we hear a lot about that now. Are we talking health and wellness as we're monitoring everything, or are we talking disease management? And I think that's going to be an interesting era of for us all to explore as we go forward.
Hello. I always find it interesting to hear these panels of industry saying that sort of the images is that the consumer wants to spend more on healthcare but is being prevented from that by some reimbursement bureaucrat at CMS or insurance plan or employer. I work with self-insured employers putting in reference pricing, and we find where they put the payment limit at, let's say, the 60th percentile of distribution of prices, consumers, when it's actually their dollar, they move for the lower priced service. provider, it's unbelievable how fast people move when it's their dollar. We've studied this in ambulatory surgery, inpatient surgery, laboratory tests, diagnostic imaging, invasive diagnostic colonoscopy. Consumers, when it's their dollar, they're looking at the price. And so I think that what's coming at the industry is, you've solved your FDA problem, you're solving your reimbursement problem, but you're going to be dealing with the price-conscious consumer spending the marginal dollar, and that's going to be a different kind of a reimbursement challenge facing the industry to prove value to the person who's not rich in particular.
I think that's a good point. So I agree to a point. I think the problem is why patients do that is because think about our healthcare system now. It was started on basically Henry Ford's principle of I'm going to cover healthcare, which was a doctor with a black bag and, turn your head and cough kind of medicine back in 1920 to employees pay up to 80%, 50%, whatever the number is, of the healthcare dollar. I will kind of push back and say, look at one in particular is plastic surgery. Plastic surgery it's fee for service. Look at LASIK surgery, fee for service. The government didn't get involved, insurance didn't get involved. And what happens is I welcome, actually, as someone who's creating a technology, I'd love there to be an open marketplace and let patients have kind of an a la carte menu in which to choose from. I do agree there's going to be a big chunk of the market that's going to say, hey, I'm looking for X. My dollar spend is this. I also think there's a huge portion of the market that's ready to be unleashed that says, I don't want to have to go to, in my healthcare system, a doctor, and I got to wait 6 hours, and then I've got 10 doctors when I'm in the hospital for a surgery. We all have had parents, brothers, sisters who have an illness. You go to a hospital today. I mean, you don't see the same doctor twice. And so I agree to a point. I do think, though, we as industry do have to sharpen our elbows and be ready for that next step, which is, hey, if you give someone you have $10,000 a year to spend, how are they going to spend it? I am of the opinion that I think consumers are a lot smarter than we give them credit for, but they have to be educated on what the best outcomes are.
I have a question. My name is Shrifal Mehta. And there's, first of all, great panel, fantastic perspectives. So thank you again for pulling this together. I have questions. My question is actually first a question and then what is the context for it, which may sound like a plug. But the question is really around CMS and FDA and the outcomes-based, evidence-based medicine and reimbursements that are being driven, like with the NICE at UK, asking for very specific qualities or quality of life assessment and the dollar payment based on some of that. How tightly linked is that becoming at the FDA, and what does that mean for the device developers today is the question. The context is, I have a book I wrote about 6 years ago called, which is the part of the plug, I guess, but it'll give you an idea why the question is coming up. The book goes through commercialization of biomedical drugs, devices, diagnostics, and I've been asked to the second edition. And in that I pointed out evidence-based medicine and payment for outcomes is going to become more and more important, and certainly that's what we are seeing coming out. I'd like to get your perspective on where that's heading, and I really value the comments in the last question also that came in. So maybe from the AdvaMed and then from yourself as a company member.
I think we're probably all going to have something to say about that. I'll try to be pretty brief. So as Bill said earlier, it's been very clear over the last 3 to 5 years, reimbursement has come up as the biggest sort of market barrier that companies are trying to get past. Partly as a result of seeing that pressure, FDA and CMS, as you probably know, have a kind of a pilot program and coordinated review. So if you choose to have CMS and FDA review your product concurrently, you can go try to be part of that program. And one of our member companies, Exact Sciences, got a test through that coordinated parallel kind of review process successfully. And as FDA has become increasingly sensitized to this. It's very interesting that when we're having sort of regulatory conversations with FDA that really don't actually have anything to do with reimbursement, FDA staff will say, yeah, but what about the reimbursement implications, even though it's really outside their purview entirely. So we're a little bit leery of FDA taking into account anything that payers are thinking about, because it's really not within their purview. We don't want them to be doing that. We don't want them to be thinking about clinical utility type questions. We want them to be focused on their statutory mandate. On the other hand, so our bigger challenges are with CMS, and I will say just broadly, I think we're at a very slow inflection point where, in general, our industry wants there to be clearer metrics. We want there to be clearer endpoints in terms of coverage and payment that you can shoot for and hit. But it's a little bit of this conundrum of live by the sword, die by the sword, right? Because we're also a little bit leery of having metrics set up that either are not appropriate, or that we can't hit for reasons that we think are unjustified. And so we want to sort of constrain expectations where that's appropriate, but also have clear expectations. And ultimately, many of our companies find value in the flexibility that's in our current reimbursement system to be able to go to multiple places. I mean, you can go to CMS in multiple places. You can go to local area contractors, go to the MACs and try to get a positive coverage decision. You can go somewhere you've got a relationship, et cetera. You've got multiple ins even just to Medicare, and of course you've got this wide diversity of private payers. So the challenge right now is, do you want something that looks more like a funnel, where you've got a more of a national coverage and payment decision process, and you're kind of, you either make it or you don't. I think most of our companies ultimately say no, but on the other hand, they want more clarity and more guidance and something more, definitive and quantitative that they can shoot for early on, which would resemble a little bit more the FDA process. So this is something that we're wrestling with. I mean, this is a broad systemic challenge right now.
A couple of comments here. First, just show of hands, how many people have heard of PCORI in the room? Less than half. So PCORI was created out of the Affordable Care Act. It's the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. And so every private health insurer in the country, a piece of your payment goes to fund that organization. And it's all about patient-centered outcomes. What they found out of that is the infrastructure in our country to really look at post-market outcomes is really lacking. It's very fragmented. And you're going to see, to Andy's point, I think a slow transition. So part of what's happening now, unique device identifiers are being put into devices. There is now a group, I actually just became part of a National Medical Device Evaluation System Planning Board, which is basically post-market surveillance. There's a real push and a desire to have post-market data in a more structured way. Also, to Andy's point, because this is new and somewhat uncharted territory, it is also somewhat unsettling, because when you're running a very highly controlled clinical trial, you are managing a lot of the variables that you are not necessarily aware of when it goes beyond market approval, because the systems aren't in place to know all that. So there's a lot of questions that are still out there, but the trends are clearly, and the desires are to have more rigor in that post-approval monitoring, assessment, and ultimately making decisions on what's going to be paid for and what value you're going to get for that. But that's going to take a while before it is actually realized.
Just talking about Mr. Daly's comments on the international sphere. I'm Ben Ball. I'm here with the Consulate of Australia, actually. So if anyone's interested in talking about the R&D tax credit or all the other incentives that Australia offers to companies, just come and talk to me.
We work closely with your medical device and diagnostic trade associations.
So it was a nice segue. We had the word tax, and we'd like to have Andy give us an update about the medical device tax and what's happened today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Vicki. It would obviously not directly connected to the topic of the panel, but since it's so critical to this industry, we wanted to take an opportunity to, give a little victory cry for an interim success on the device tax. As many of you are aware, the Affordable Care Act imposed a 2.3% excise tax on medical devices as just part of a wide array of funding streams for the Affordable Care Act. It was originally proposed at more like 4%, and we battled it back down to to 2.3%. But we've been fighting it ever since, and been on a very aggressive campaign that's brought in a lot of stakeholders outside just the medtech industry, campaigning for the repeal of the device tax, which I should take pains to point out is not an attack on the Affordable Care Act itself, but driven by a recognition that it's just poor policy in terms of constraint on innovation to have an excise tax, and just bad policy to structure it that way in the first place, but let alone to put this additional headwind on the medtech industry. I think it's short-sighted public policy. So we've been fighting it all ever since. And as you may have heard, at the end of the year, Congress included in a very large budget package a temporary suspension of the device tax. So we have a 2-year respite from the device tax for 2016, 2017. We will continue to fight for full repeal, but this is a significant win because it's a congressional endorsement of the arguments we've been bringing forward, and it gives us an opportunity to come back again in 2 years as this, is going to expire, and to continue this fight. So I just wanted to say that we appreciate everyone across, a lot of different sectors. There were patient and research advocacy organizations that joined with us on that, collaboration across multiple associations working against that tax, and it's a major win, even if interim.
Any last questions? Okay, final thoughts. Bill, why don't you start?
I'd start by saying I think this is a very exciting time for our industry, for patients. The technologies, the rapid evolution of technology right now is very exciting, and so that's opening up new paradigms of treatments, new paradigms of diagnostics, and the whole precision medicine and tailoring care, I think, is very exciting. So I think for those companies that are able to really show value and bring those new technologies through the process, it's not easy. There is a real opportunity to create value for your companies in today's environment. And I do see a thawing of the investors in terms of returning to and supporting this ecosystem as a great ecosystem to invest in.
So Jay Flatley, who's the CEO of Illumina, one of the market leaders in next-generation gene sequencing technology, said recently that he thinks one of the reasons that their company has continued to do so well and expand so rapidly is that he sees what they're, the area they're in is essentially an unbounded market. And while obviously that can't literally be true, I think, it's not false either. And if you look at just that one area of what they're unlocking in terms of the value of genetic and genomic understanding driving healthcare decision making, and then you think about all the other areas in which medtech is moving in terms of convergence and future value of care and the ability to tailor treatments and interventions to individuals, there is going to be just tremendous value unlocked, which means tremendous additional revenue, justifiable revenue. I mean, I don't want to come across as though we're saying healthcare costs are just going to continue to go up. I mean, I think what we're talking about is a value proposition where additional spending up front is going to bring additional savings and efficiencies down the line. But the bottom line here is, I think, one of that you should be cautious optimism, which is there's tremendous value out there. Over the next few years, I think we're going to see a lot shake out. The tide may go out a little bit on some of these, especially in kind of the digital and data areas, and we'll see kind of who's on the beach and who's still floating. But I think there's tremendous value to be pursued, and I just encourage anyone who's kind of in the early stages to think about some of the issues we raised and be as thoughtful as possible and gather a lot of information, talk to a lot of people, go in early and talk to FDA. I would encourage you to go in early and talk to CMS and private payers too, and to figure out how to navigate this path forward. But there's a lot of potential out there.
Wow, it's really tough to follow these two guys. So maybe two pieces of advice is cross at the green, not in between, and get one of those wallets that protects your credit cards. These guys have done a great job. The one thing I will say, to Andy's point, is someone who's been living that for the last 10 years. We've raised $125 million. We've done a PMA, a CE mark, and launched a product. And I will tell you that every step along the way, we were told you can't do it. And you're going to run into that. The thing I would consistently say is if you really believe in your technology, you really believe it's going to be a game changer, then, the hell with it. Just keep going forward. As long as you feel like you can balance what that outcome is and, what that time and energy it's going to take to do it, then I think you'll be successful.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel members and ask you to join me in thanking them.